evening, everyone, and welcome to the Stanley Spencer Gallery in a virtual setting. I'm Amanda Bradley and I am a trustee of the museum, and I'm also chair of the Exhibitions Committee, and I also curated the gallery's current exhibition, Love, Art, Loss, The Wives of Stanley Spencer. I'm just going to start off by saying a few words about the gallery, which is housed in a Methodist chapel in Cookham, where Stanley Spencer worshipped as a child. And as he said, it's a simple Gothic structure for sheep gone astray, which I think is a rather charming description of it. The gallery was refurbished in 2006, thanks to a HLF grant, and now it has the largest selection of works by Stanley Spencer on display in the UK and abroad, along with a lot of long-term loans of great quality. The gallery was opened in 1962, 3 years after Stanley's death, and it remains a charitable trust. It's a fully accredited museum, and also, most importantly, it's run entirely by volunteers. And this is a really important point. I have never come across a more professional group of people, and if any of you out there would like to share ideas or sign up to be a volunteer, you would be very, very welcome. So importantly, the gallery is in Cookham, which is where Stanley Spencer was born. He lived in a house on the high street called Fernley, and he lived there with his parents and his brothers and sisters. They were a large family, and he was homeschooled by his sister, and as such he did not spell very well, but he was highly literate, very educated, had an extraordinary knowledge of music and literature, and this really permeates his art and his thinking. As I'm sure many of you are aware, that Cookham really assumed a huge artistic and emotional resonance for Stanley. You know, it permeated his whole being and his art, and as such, whenever he moved away, that was really problematic for him. And as such, you know, his landscapes are infused with the Cookham landscape, and they assume a sort of almost biblical resonance. And for Stanley, Cookham, religion and sex are often, you know, assumed into a central sort of philosophy, if you like, which is visible in his work, and we'll come to look at that in a bit. This isn't a great photo, I'm afraid, but I've been thinking a little bit about Stanley and this sort of historiography and sort of this notion of him as the sort of sex-mad, eccentric artist, which I think the artist as an eccentric might have some truth to it. And here is Stanley in later years rolling his pram around Cookham High Street, and the pram and his palette are still in the gallery where you can come and see it. And quite often, you know, he'd be wearing his pajamas underneath his suit. And so I can quite understand how that image might have come about. But as we'll see later on, I think, you know, this notion of him being sex mad is misconstrued. And I think many of his paintings, which were incredibly avant-garde for the 1930s, and so human and so autobiographical, you know, gave rise to this misguided perception of someone who actually in reality had very few sexual partners. So why is Spencer so important? Why do we have this gallery dedicated to him? And I think really Stanley Spencer is the greatest of all modern British artists, and you know, you might say, I would say that, but I really believe that's the case. And I just want to read this little quote from Stanley. And he said, "Usually, in order to describe any one picture of mine, it means taking a seat and preparing to hear the story of my life." So for me, his work is about humanity. It's about human experience. And you've got to remember, at the time when he was painting, at the turn of the century, you know, everyone was moving towards abstraction. And, you know, there was a lot of snobbishness about those who were still painting in the figurative tradition. They were looked down upon, and they were seen as retardés, almost elegiac, looking back to the past, pre-war. And actually, you know, Stanley remained, you know, he had this very personal vision, and, you know, his hyperrealism, his attention to detail, and this sort of huge psychological power through these very expressive figurative works are what make him stand out. And without him, we would not have Freud, we would not have Bacon, and I don't think we would have Grayson Perry, but he might have something else to say about that. And actually at this point I want to quickly mention Roger Fry, who was very important to Spencer whilst at the Slade, because he gave this very important series of lectures on the importance of old master paintings, and through his lectures Stanley became acquainted with the artistic practice, mostly of early Renaissance artists. But Fry also looked down on Spencer. As we know, Fry was all about significant form, the hierarchy of form and discriminating form. So whereas Spencer, whereas Fry was about exclusion, Spencer was about inclusion. And, everything was given equal significance, and this was really important to his artistic practice. So moving on to our first slide, and I wanted to bookend our talk with two self-portraits by Spencer. So, compared to other talks in this series, this is going to be quite biographical and chronological. So this is the first of the self-portraits at which we're going to be looking, and it's the earliest in our collection in oil. And this was painted in 1923. And I think it's very beautiful, and it was painted while Stanley was staying with his fellow artist Henry Lamb in Poole in Dorset. And I can see a really sort of synchronicity between Henry Lamb's style and Spencer's style, and respect for the artist he was staying with, and who was also sort of a bit of a business mentor to him at the time as well. And so up until now, we haven't really talked about what Spencer's been doing. So Spencer's artistic ability was recognised fairly early on. And in 1907, he went to Maidenhead Technical College. 1908 to 1912, he went to the Slade, where he studied with a stellar group of artists, Gertler, Nash, Nevinson, Dora Carrington, to name a few. And that group was called, by David Boyd Haycock in his brilliant book, they were termed the Second Crisis of Brilliance. This stellar group with this, burgeoning, artistic talent. And they were also exceptional in that they were students, but also practicing artists. So they achieved status while they were still students, and that is quite exceptional, I would say. In 1912, Stanley exhibited in Roger Fry's second post-impressionist exhibition. These exhibitions were also important to Stanley, and I think Gauguin for him was quite important at that time. These sort of slabs of colour, I think, certainly came from artists of that period and at that time. Flicking through biographically very quickly. So throughout the war, Spencer served 1915 in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He worked in a military hospital in Bristol, and more of that anon. And he then went to the, I'd say, forgotten front of Macedonia, where he served in the RAMC and in the Royal Berkshires, where he saw active service. And I think some would argue that his time in the Royal Army Medical Corps, created particularly, psychologists have argued that those who serve in this way suffer more post-traumatic stress because they have seen such sort of constant death and these sort of series of wounded coming in, and so this really affected him, particularly in religious terms. He lost his Christian faith, not completely, but it morphed into something much more idiosyncratic, where he drew upon Eastern traditions and psychology as well. So looking back, getting back to this portrait, which he painted just after he'd met his wife to be, Hilda Carline, and here is she. And this was painted more or less around the same time in 1923. And here she is in her studio in Hampstead. And this is where they met, at one of the Carline's artistic soirees, and she was serving him soup, and Stanley felt there was this, there was a coup de foudre, there was a meeting of minds, and she was serving him soup, and was blown away, and he felt there was a real synchronicity between the two, and he wrote about it extensively. Indeed, he wrote about everything extensively. And here is Hilda, and she, this portrait, which is of exceptional brilliance and talent, I would argue, shows Hilda in this beautiful cornelian necklace, which was brought back by her brothers in 1919 from Persia, and that is also in our current exhibition, which was brought to us by Shireen, their eldest daughter, and they had another daughter, Unity, as well. So I find this portrait quite interesting because here is Hilda stuck in her bedroom, which has to double as a studio, whereas her brothers had a large studio in the house. But that was the fate of female artists at the time. So getting back to Stanley, you know, he admitted that this portrait wasn't entirely finished, and he also wrote about, he said, my head is in such a position as hardly to be able to see what I am painting. And indeed, you know, he has got it resting against a door frame, I think. But it really gives a sense of a man, of the man. Right, moving on. So he got engaged to Hilda in 1922, and the engagement was rather fraught. Spencer frequently got cold feet, one of which times was when she was having her wedding dress fitted, and ultimately they were married, and he insisted she didn't wear anything sort of typically wedding dressy, and she was married in a brown velvet suit and a tricorn hat. So going back a few years chronologically, this is quintessential Spencer, The Last Supper. So here we have a religious scene set in Cookham, in an oast house, and in Cookham, and you've got the grain store behind Christ. And so again, you know, it's a bit like, you know, early Renaissance artists bringing miraculous religious events to their own actuality, and this is what Spencer has done here. And for me, this has, you know, many similarities with Giotto's Arena Chapel, you know, this sort of plainer way of painting. And also I think there are some similarities also to Donatello's relief of the Dance of Salome and the baptistry font at Siena Cathedral. The detail in this is beautiful. You know, beauty has become a dirty word, but the way in which it is painted is really beautiful. And I do urge you to go to the gallery to look at the way this is painted, the way these bricks are painted sort of so minutely. It is really stunning in the flesh, and Spencer's works really merit being seen in the flesh. You've got this wonderful interplay of red and white, which again, you know, highlights the Eucharistic theme of the subject matter. You've got John resting his head against Christ's shoulder, and then Judas looking away with his hand on his mouth. And Spencer's resolved this problem of a void in the foreground by creating this sort of lovely abstract pattern of the disciples' feet joining together, which is not only beautiful but also creates this lovely sense of communion. Also interesting for me is, you know, Spencer gave this to one of his patrons, Henry Schlesser, who lived very close to Cookham in Bourne End, and Stanley stayed with him for a bit after the war. And this was a time when he was really resolving his feelings, having served in the war, and this was really an opportunity for him to sort of consolidate how he was feeling. And he'd been thinking about this subject matter since 1915, when he'd been doing sketches, and he gave this this work to Henry Schlesser, and it was particularly appropriate for him, I feel, and ultimately it was housed in his oratory, in his boathouse. And Henry Schlesser in 1924 became Solicitor General. He was a Fabian. He was an Anglo-Catholic with a deep regard for mystics, apparently. And he was really interested in philosophy, ontology, the nature of being, and he even wrote a book about that. And he also wrote about the beauty of art and the social relevance of art. And I think this Christian socialism became, you know, really important to Spencer, who I think, you know, his ideals really chimed with Schlesser's. And he famously Schlesser formed this sort of walking confraternity, which Spencer joined with his brother Gilbert and the likes of G.K. Chesterton and other sort of literary and philosophical greats, and they would walk and talk. And, Stanley writes quite a lot about Schlesser and is sometimes a little bit rude about him, as he could be, but he often contradicts himself. So you sort of have to weave your way through what Spencer writes. He, as I said, he wrote extensively. And I think ultimately, Schlesser was very formative in these early years, and sort of creating this sort of philosophical Christian outlook for Spencer. So also for the boathouse, Stanley painted 2 other paintings, which were to form part of a triptych. And I think thinking about these works as an ensemble was very important for Spencer's greatest ensemble, I believe, which was the Sandon Memorial Chapel, which he painted at Berkeley for the Barron family. And I think this is really one of the great glories of Western art, and I would also urge you to go and see this. And when we did the exhibition for this at Somerset House, the hardened old soul Brian Sewell even said it brought a tear to his eyes. Such is the power of these wartime reminiscences of Spencer. So I think, these few works he did for Schlesser were very important on sort of building up the confidence to do this. And also at the gallery, we've got these 2 works which formed the 2 side panels of the triptych in the boathouse, St. Veronica unmasking Christ, and also Christ overturning the money changers' tables. And the central panel, also of Christ and the money changers, is in the Art Gallery of Western Australia. And again, you get these lovely sort of planar effects, these sort of use of blocked colour, and again the play of red and white, which for me is like when they're all together is very musical in the way the colours flow. And again, there's sort of Eucharistic sensibility through the play of red and white. So more quintessential Spencer. So after Berkeley, he found going to the wall painting Berkeley quite difficult, because obviously he had to move away from Cookham, and he came back in 1932, and this is one of the first paintings that he did, and this, all his Cookham feelings were coming back again. And this is Sarah Tubb and the 7 Heavenly Visitors, and this is Granny Tubb, as Spencer called her. And Halley's Comet in 1910 had created a sunset so vivid that Granny Tubb thought the apocalypse was nigh, and she sank to her knees in Cookham High Street. And Spencer called it a sort of apotheosis of the old lady. And true to form, heaven has come to Cookham, and you've got these heavenly beings here offering sort of tokens to Granny Tubb, who's modelled by her daughter Sarah, and things that represent who she is. And you've got Spencer's 2 cousins, Annie, the shopkeeper, and the grocer, modelled on his cousin Will. And it's all about religious fervour, and so I'm just remembering something Spencer had also said. It's also about him making love to Sarah Tubb. So again, you get this sort of rather unholy trinity, if you like, of religion, sex, and Cookham, which, this is why this is quintessential Spencer. And this painting is also important because it's part of the Barbara Carmel bequest, which came to the gallery in 1995. Barbara Carmel is extremely interesting. She came from the Burton family, a family of patrons and philanthropists. And Barbara Carmel was also married to Edward Beddington Behrens, who was a really important patron of Spencer's at this time, and for other modern British artists. And his first acquisition, he was a bit of a player, and in 1920 he won some money at the tables and bought a Picasso, and that started, he came from an extremely artistically enlightened family, and for me, to have someone of such enlightened artistic sensibility to take Spencer under his wing is illustrative of Spencer's importance. And here we have another painting from the Carmel bequest, Neighbours, which again is all about, you know, neighbourliness in Cookham, and sort of another monument to life in Cookham. And you have Spencer's sister and his cousin exchanging gifts over their garden hedge. So at the chest of drawers, so moving on a few years, so Spencer returned to Cookham with his wife Hilda, and here she is, you know, they're sorting through the drawers, the collars, you know, spilling out in a rather beautiful way, and it's quite a cosy scene. Hilda's in her fluffy slippers, you've got the hot water bottle in the bed, and you've got this sort of overwhelming presence of Hilda, with, you know, Stanley's this sort of little diminutive presence. It was part of the Church House series, well, part of the Domestic Scenes series, which painted between 1935 and 1936. And they're about the sort of joy and significance of marriage. And they were ultimately to go into this other collection of paintings called the Church House series, which was really a sort of monument to love and loss and Spencer, which was obviously never realised. So this is sort of about memorialising and idealising his marriage, which really was an unattainable ideal. Their relationship was fraught. Hilda suffered from depression. Stanley had a fierce temper, and, you know, much has been made of, you know, Stanley being demonised for his behaviour, and he didn't behave very well. But equally, you know, Hilda was complicated too. And it's very easy to make judgments, and one never really knows what goes on in a relationship. But the irony is, you know, he's painting this, he's celebrating his marriage, and yet a year before he'd painted this of his companion, Patricia Priest, whom he'd met in 1929. He'd come back to Cookham and he'd met Patricia in a tea shop, and all his Cookham feelings had come back. And, you know, Patricia had, you know, symbolised, you know, this deep psychological change and this sort of artistic generation, and he became obsessed with her. And she would come to, once he'd moved back to Cookham, after painting the Berkeley series, she'd come to his house in the evenings and model for him. And this was one of the first nudes that he painted of her in 1935. And, you know, talking about sort of Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, you know, the influence of Otto Dix, and, you know, sort of hyper-realism, you know, the veins in her breast and the sort of hair running up her stomach. And, you know, I find it, you know, this sort of mirroring of her breasts and her nipples with the sort of shiny leather buttoned sofa behind her. It's and she almost looks a bit like a rabbit in the headlights. It's a startling image, and if you think, you know, this was painted in 1935, it was, you know, quite hard to bear at the time. Stanley spent a lot of money on Patricia. He lavished her with underwear and jewellery, and, you know, as you all know, he later painted, you know, much more graphic nudes of her and him, which I thought I would spare you at this hour. And he also, at a later date, described how his paintbrush was like an ant crawling all over her body. So you can imagine what he was thinking about. And the irony was, Patricia had no interest in having a sexual relationship with Spencer. She was a lesbian, and, you know, she thought that, you know, Hilda could satisfy that part of, you know, she could be his sort of emotional confidant, and Hilda could satisfy the physical side. And Stanley really would have loved to have had 3 wives, but Hilda wasn't having any of it. And ultimately in 1937, Hilda divorced Stanley, and it was a disaster. You know, he married Patricia right afterwards, and on their wedding night, you know, she went off. Stanley had to finish a commission, and he ultimately spent his wedding night with Hilda, which gave Patricia the perfect excuse to separate from him. And so he was ultimately left with nothing. And this is the artistic result of this emotional fallout, which is one of the Beatitudes series. This is Contemplation, painted in 1938. And, you know, this is the sort of emotional wilderness that Stanley found himself in. And it is ugly. There's no two ways about it. You know, these spindly heads, spindly feet, these amorphous wafting bodies, and this extraordinary sort of ear behind the main profile. It sort of juts into her nose, and, you know, these looming crooked faces in the background. And yet, amidst all this, there is this extremely beautiful moment between these two people who are enraptured with each other. And there is a real physical sense of a connection between the two. And, you know, Stanley insisted, you know, that, you know, beauty was within. You know, how people looked did not matter. You know, as Christian a motto as that. And, you know, for him, ugliness, not beauty, exemplified love. And, you know, it really was a meditation for him on the nature of love and its complexity. And again, you know, looking back to paintings like The Last Supper, which were really about sort of early Renaissance art and the sort of purity of religion, of colour, of tonality and form. And for me, this is sort of a move north to, you know, Cranach's mismatched couples, or, you know, Otto Dix, and again, you know, Christian Schad, you know, this an almost degenerate art as well, which obviously was very apt in 1938. And he would have seen all this in 1922 when he'd gone on his trip to Croatia with Hilda. But I think the difference is, with Stanley, you know, his work is not satirical. And again, you know, to bring about this notion of humanity, it's about humanity. You know, there's never a sort of negative moment for him. And so I just wanted to include this rather curious wedding photo of Stanley with Patricia, Dorothy Hepworth, Patricia's lover, and James Wood, the artist. And I wanted to finish on this beautiful self-portrait, my other side of the bookend, which Spencer drew in 1959 when he knew he was going to die of cancer. And for me, this sort of frailty, the rawness of it, this beautiful cross-hatching technique which owes much to Michelangelo, again, which he would have learnt at the Slade, through Henry Tonks, you know, when he was learning to be a draftsman. And this, you know, is the most incredibly moving for me vision of a man who is about to die. And the patron actually, I think, probably found it a little too hard to stomach and really wanted an oil. So he was then compelled to paint this version in oil, which for me somehow lacks the rawness of the sketch in Red Conte, the sort of waxy type chalk. Right, well, thank you all so very much indeed for coming, and thank you for such a lovely breadth, a number of questions, and I hope to see you all in the gallery. Goodbye.